Every man must have one secret, even if only one from his wife. All is yours, everywhere is open to you, except the lock that this single key fits. Yet all it is the key to a little room at the foot of the West Tower, behind the still room, at the end of a dark little corridor full of horrid cobwebs that would get into your hair and frighten you if you ventured there. Oh, and you'd find it such a dull little room. You must promise me, if you love me, to leave it well alone. It is only a private study, a hideaway, a den, as the English say, where I can go sometimes on those infrequent yet inevitable occasions when the yoke of marriage seems to weigh too heavily on my shoulders. There I can go, you understand, to savor the rare pleasure of imagining myself wifeless. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 4, and we are finishing up our series on the fairy tale. So the intro that Mel read for us was The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. And we knew as soon as we started planning a series on the fairy tale that we would have to end up talking about Angela Carter. And I am oh so glad that we did. So if you recognize that, the story of the Bloody Chamber is based on the fairy tale Bluebeard. So, of course, his little private study, his hideaway, his den, is not just a place where he can go to imagine himself wifeless, but where he can also go and see the rotting corpses of his ex-wives. So a lovely, lovely little room he has there. Mel, you chose the opening for it. Tell us a little bit about why don't we start with Angela Carter, and then we can talk a little bit about this story in particular.
Sure. Yeah, we can talk a little bit about Angela Carter. So, Angela Carter was a British writer. She passed away in 1992. She was just 51 years old. And she wrote several novels. She wrote screenplays. She wrote lots of short stories. But one of the things that she's probably most famous for writing was her, I think she used the term reformulation of fairy tales. So she often said that she wasn't just revisiting fairy tales or even revising fairy tales. She said that she was like reframing them, reformulating them, taking bits and pieces of them and changing them kind of for her own purposes. And so a lot of the quote unquote fairy tale stories that she wrote kind of bring back, I think, in some ways, the the violence and sex, I guess, that the Grimms had been slowly kind of excising from their fairy tales, as we talked about in our first episode. But Carter's tales also do some really interesting things with gender. Of course, after The Bloody Chamber came out, I believe it was in 79, in the next decade or two, people, talked about how they wish that she had pushed her portrayals of sexuality more, maybe been more diverse. And, some feminists had issues with some of her ideas about feminism. I saw in a couple articles where she said she didn't really want to toe the line with what people thought. So she was often a rebel, even in causes that she believed in or felt like she was a part of. But one of the reasons that I picked this introductory quote is, well, one, I thought the end on the word wifeless was just the right effect that we were going for, since we're talking about horror in these stories. But also I thought, this idea of the Bloody Chamber in my mind is really fascinating because, yes, it's the Bluebeard myth, and yes, the Bluebeard character kind of gets his comeuppance at the end. But she does some really interesting things, I think, with like equating love with violence, with this idea of like the powerlessness of that the woman may feel, but then also she's a quite powerful character, especially by the end of the story with her mother entering into the picture. And this is something that goes on in other tales as well, like her, Carter's retellings of the Little Red Riding Hood, which I assume we may speak about in this episode, had different, endings as well. And in one, I guess I'll go ahead and spoil, it's been out since 1979, but in one, Little Red Riding Hood can protect herself quite well. And in the other, Little Red Riding Hood basically kind of seduces the wolf before he can hurt her. And yet, even in those stories, she has these passing portraits of women in trying to survive and under very kind of oppressive circumstances. So I don't know. That might have been more rambling than what you wanted, Lisa, but I feel like that's just a little snapshot of why we would want to talk about Angela Carter with something like this.
I think that was a really good snapshot. I had read the Bloody Chamber before, and I was rereading it in preparation for this episode. And the thing that struck me is not just that, she does, and we can talk about the ending of it in a minute and how she kind of turns it into a kind of heroic ending. Although I had read other Bluebeard myths that had the young girl, the kind of last wife, being the hero of it. So that wasn't totally new. But what I found interesting were the different female characters that you got, and the idea of what they want, and what you said, Mel, about the ideas of love and violence and those kind of being equated in a way in a lot of her works. One of the first thing I noticed that I don't think I had noticed before, I don't know why, when I had read this story before, is when the daughter is going off to marry does he have a name in this story? Like, besides being like a French, I mean, he's the richest man in France. That's basically what we get.
I was just actually paging through the story because I think I remember when I was reading the story a couple days ago that it does mention a name at one point, but it's only maybe once or twice, and I do not remember.
Yeah, it's really interesting because for him to be such an overbearing character, and I mean, he literally cast a shadow over the whole movie. Oh my gosh. I'm tired, guys.
She just calls him her husband, basically.
Right. Well, there's a lot of naming in that way, like my husband, my wife,
my lover.
My lover, yeah. But one thing I thought was really interesting was when she's going off to marry him, her mother says, "Do you love him?" And it's curious because she doesn't answer. She says, "I want to marry him."
I'm sure I want to marry him.
Yeah. So, it's not a question of, so love and marriage are not equated. And the young girl talks about how she's, naive, and a lot of people see her that way. In fact, she thinks that's what attracted him to her, was her kind of innocence. Of course, she is in some way, but she's also not, because she seemed to know what she was getting into when she married him, knowing that she wasn't marrying for love.
And that disappoints her mom. I mean, her mom is a pretty intense character, very defensive, protective, face down pirates. I mean, I was so intrigued by the mom. I wanted to read all about the mom and not this girl. I mean, the mom even sighs dramatically when she realizes her daughter is not even marrying for love. The mom character really got, I was really taken by her this time around.
Yeah, we can talk about the mom and everything she does, because she is, I had to read that one line over again where it was like, here comes my mom who faced down the tiger. When she was only 18 years old, and I'm going, wait, what?
Yeah, she carries the gun around with her wherever she goes.
Absolutely. Yeah, that, as if that was a way of explaining it. It was like, well, there was this one time with a tiger when she was young, so of course she carries a gun everywhere. It doesn't matter that it's France. But the mom was really interesting, and in contrast, you had the old nurse who had raised the girl, who apparently by the end, when she realizes that the young girl is not gonna inherit or does not have money, is not wealthy anymore. Apparently just like dies of shame, I guess. They didn't really explain that one either. It was just, poor old nurse is now dead and gone because she just couldn't bear the fact that I wasn't married to this rich man anymore.
I mean, she has all his stuff, but she doesn't have him. So I guess that's what the nurse's issue was.
I guess. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about the ending. We might as well. It was published in 1979, so we can spoil away, I think. So Bluebeard, that's what we're gonna call him. He tells her not to go into his room, and of course, eventually she does. She says she starts to feel comfortable in the house. She calls her mother to say that she's so happy that she has the gold dolphin or swan, or I don't know.
It was the golden dolphins with the blue eyes, and she was crying when she was talking about it. Yeah.
Yes. She was so happy that those were the faucets in her bathroom. They were shaped like gold dolphins with blue eyes, and she just thought this was, immensely lovely. And this is what, of course, sets off the mom. But she does, of course, go look into the room. It does not take her very long. She's like, well, he can't have secrets from me. I live in this house too. I'm going to go see what that's about. Turns out to be a big mistake. Of course, there are dead bodies. But in the end, it's not the daughter. The daughter seems that she's just going to take her punishment, which is execution by decapitation.
Yeah, she was already prepared with the necklace that she was wearing.
Yeah, he makes her like go bathe. It's a whole ritual. He makes her go bathe and put on this like white dress, which, by the way, there was a lot of white virginal imagery in this story that made me really uncomfortable. Another thing I noticed that I hadn't really paid much attention to was when, after their wedding night, when they make things consummated, I guess. And he makes the comment that, we don't do this anymore, but if we did, I could put out our blood-stained sheets as a flag and show that, you were a proper virgin, which was, and apparently she's the first one that has been that way too, which was immensely creepy. But again, it's that whole like virginal innocence thing that must have attracted him to her in the first place.
That goes back to his predatory behavior, because even their consummation of their marriage is more assault-like, because she's protesting at one point because he's hurting her, basically for his own pleasure. That's partially why she wants to call her mom, even though she doesn't tell her mom that.
But mom knows.
Mm-hmm.
Because she is crying. And so at the end, now mom doesn't know that she's about to be killed, although she may suspect it because all the other wives have not met happy endings. But at the end, when she's about to lose her head quite literally, mom shows up with the shotgun and takes out old Bluebeard right through the eyes.
She's a very good shot. She shoots him from on top of a horse.
Yes.
Because she gallops in on a horse because she's afraid she's going to be late.
Yes. Yeah, and then that's when we get of course, mom's here to save the day. And the mom does say, she's like, well, I heard you crying over those stupid dolphins, and I knew, things were not right, that you weren't happy, which I thought that was a really interesting idea to play up there. It wasn't just my daughter, married an abusive man, presumably for power and money, but the mom's main concern is that her daughter was not happy.
And she's okay with her new lover because she actually loved that guy, the piano tuner. They actually had stuff in common and fell in love.
There is a blind piano tuner who stays around and kind of befriends her while her husband's away. And it's a weirdly kind of happy and modern ending too, because they get together. The mom's happy. The old nurse kills herself or dies. I guess it doesn't say she commits suicide. And then it says she inherits the money, but she gives it all away to charity, except she turns the castle into a school for the blind, but she hopes it's not haunted. And she keeps a portion of the money back to start a music school, which I thought, I don't know, I thought that was really interesting because I could see where she was coming from, where Carter was coming from with this whole like blending of love and sex and violence. But there was a lot of interesting things to do with money in this as well. With wealth and who owns wealth and what they do with it. I don't know. I'm not quite sure if I have an idea on what was quite going on there, but there was a lot there.
Yeah, there is one. Well, and this is kind of, I guess, adding on to that. But one of the themes, I guess you would say, that I was noticing this time around was this idea of identity. I mean, the husband is concealing his identity from his wife because it's almost like this really extreme, like separation of husband and wife. He's with her only when he needs something from her, and he was looking for someone who he could manipulate. He really wants to be wifeless. She doesn't quite know who she is. I think from the very beginning, the irritation of the mother is that she doesn't know why she's marrying. She often talks about looking in mirrors and seeing a potential for something in her that's like him, but she doesn't like that. And I wonder if the story is also about this idea of like knowing who you are and how that relates in relationship with other people, because the idea of concealment, right? Like he has that file folder that says personal with one sheet of paper in it that tells her nothing about him on purpose because he's hidden all his violent tendencies in that room. And this idea of looking in mirrors, mirrors all over the bedchamber, mirrors everywhere he takes her, mirrors in the torture room, and also keys, like unlocking things piece by piece. It's very gothic, but I think it's also very kind of psychological and quotation mark way, but that I wonder if Carter's getting to like how we hide our motives from ourselves and also how like disconnected we are. I mean, her place is to be locked up in the tower the whole time while he goes off and takes care of his business until he's done with her, and then he's probably going to kill her and add her to his menagerie. I mean, it's intense separation of the spheres, domesticity, right? And his kind of evilness is concealed somewhere in that place that shouldn't be such a horrific fit for her.
That's really interesting. Going back to that idea of spheres of domesticity, that was one of the places where she protested the most was when he said he was going to leave her.
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was really interesting because I was like, really? After everything you've been through with him, he's pretty much been presented as a monster already. I mean, he's not hiding his violent tendencies well. And then she's like, wait a minute, you're leaving? Like, we just got married, you're leaving? And that struck me as strange.
It's almost like she's going through the motions of what she thinks a marriage would be without actually having the real connection.
Well, she is. I mean, because that's what she says at the beginning, isn't it? Do you love him? No, but I want to be married to him. Mm-hmm. Or no, she doesn't even say, I don't love him. She just says, I want to be married.
Right. This is slightly unrelated, but what did you make of the fact, Lisa in particular, with the fact that one of his ex-wives was named Carmilla and apparently was a descendant of a vampire?
For a moment, I mean, I knew I had read this story before, but I'm always hoping that when she unlocks the door, that she's going to see all these dead bodies and just one of them would rise up. Like I was like, oh, Carmilla, yeah, she's about to come up and it's going to be like, well, here's the true motive. See, if I was writing this story, the true motive would be the husband is killing all the wives or bringing all the wives for his Carmilla to devour. And Carmilla is really, the one true one that's locked away. But, that's not the way Carter wrote it. But I did like that nice nod uh, to, well, several different vampire stories there. No, she wrote this quite clearly for this to be not just a fairy tale, but as you mentioned it's very much in the Gothic tradition. The house is presented as very Gothic. The kind of abusive male figure that is exerting power and violence over a woman. Although in this case, and again, this is what she's known for, her kind of feminist takes, but you don't get another, like a Valancourt. You don't get like another male love interest coming and storming the castle. Instead, you get the mother being the ultimate protector, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, her new love interest definitely befriends her and supports her and isn't going to leave her. Almost dies, kind of trying to protect her or be with her and offer support. But yeah, it's the mother who rides in on the horse and takes him out. And yeah, I found that really striking. That it was more about the female community, I guess, than it was her finding a man to help her get away.
Right. And the fact that she gets a love interest in the end seems almost tangential. It's almost like, oh yeah, and this happened too, and it was awesome for her. But you're right, it was more about finding that female community that gave it the happy ending in the end. And the other one was just, yeah, I mean, it was just extra.
It reminded me a little bit of, and we don't have to go too far down this, but it reminded me a little bit of, I believe it was one of Elizabeth Gaskell's stories, The Gray Woman, I think was what it was called, where this woman, it's a Bluebeard kind of retelling where this woman marries this horrible man and is trying to escape. And in that story, if I'm remembering correctly, in that story, the maid in the house helps her escape, unlike the one in this story that's kind of loyal to the Bluebeard type character. So again, if I'm getting all the details correct, I'm just now like checking to see if I'm correct. But you have women fighting against the character, not a mother, but just another woman who happens to be in the house.
Yeah. Well, I do think I've read several kind of versions of this story where either the young girl or the young girl with the help of other women learn what's happening and turn, all of a sudden it turns into, well, everybody's on horses fighting and they win.
Yeah, I want to say in Gaskell's story, the woman and the maidservant actually dress like men in order for part of their escape. So it's a really fascinating take. I don't recall that there was a wildly violent end, but I just kept thinking about that story while I was rereading The Bloody Chamber this time. So yeah, I mean, you're right. Like Angela Carter isn't the only woman rewriting this tale. To have the woman win out at the end. I mean, I guess in a lot of ways it even goes back to 1001 Arabian Nights, where the woman keeps telling the stories to keep the guy from killing her so that she can formulate her plan to kill him in revenge. It's an old story.
Well, that is one thing that it's funny because we think about fairy tales as, well, they don't always present women in the best of light, and they tend to be a little bit patriarchal, but I always think, a lot of times we don't give fairy tales enough credit. Like they are rather easy to turn into feminist tales. And I think this is a good example of that because there is a lot of times really strong and smart females who have their own agency. That's just a perfect example of one. Of course, a lot of writers have done this. I mean, we've talked about Angela Carter because that was immediately where I think both of our brains went when we were talking about revisionist fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, Anne Sexton in her poem, she used a lot of fairy tale imagery. There was that one about Cinderella and the prince. I'm forgetting a lot of hers, but Margaret Atwood had the robber bride, and then Helen Oyeyemi, who is one of my favorites, did a boy Snow Bird, which is a Snow White retelling in a way.
Yeah, Boy Snowbird is a really fascinating book. I really like White is for Witching, but I just read Boy Snowbird like in the last, I guess, month or so. And it's really fascinating to me. What she's doing is, as Oyeyemi often does, is deal with identity, which I guess is interesting coming off the Bloody Chamber. But there's lots of mirrors in Boy Snowbird where characters look in mirrors and don't see themselves when they should, or see someone else. One character starts seeing a mirror image of herself just out in the world, doing things that she doesn't really want to do or have happen. Um, and in an interview that I read, Oyeyemi said that she kind of wanted to explore the wicked stepmother and kind of unpack that character, and humanize that idea a bit. And so when you're reading Boy Snowbird, you think that Boy, the woman in the book, is going to be a evil stepmother to Snow, and she kind of is, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And one of the other things I thought was interesting about the book is that she's playing with the idea of identity, with the idea of racial passing. So Boy marries this man and has a child, and then finds out that the man's family um, has been passing as white for many, many years. And there's all sorts of things that they've kind of done in their past to hide that. That hasn't been great or good for other people in the family. So it's this really kind of complex and fascinating story that plays on all sorts of fables and fairy tales. They even have like the Pied Piper type character in it as well, in a way. And I think there might have even been like a Cinderella reference. It was just fun to read and catch all the references, I guess, and see how she was turning them all on their heads.
There was another writer, and I can't remember who it was now, who was taking some different fables and turning them into, because you reminded me of it when you said racial passing, because she was taking them and using them as almost a telling the story of slavery, but of the slave trade in Africa. And before I started telling this, I should have thought harder about the name, because now I can't remember. It flew right out of my head.
Huh.
The frustrating thing is I'm going to remember this at midnight tonight, and then I'm going to scream it out, and there's going to be nobody to hear me say it. So if I remember it later, I will come back. But I do love the way a lot of these modern writers are taking fables and fairy tales and stories that we know. And I think that does, you mentioned like Boy Snowbird kind of had a fun feeling to it because it was something that was accessible, but at the same time, it was attached to a real kind of trauma that people have lived through, and addressing some things that aren't always easy to talk about, which I think, and we've talked about this before, but I think good horror does that, and I think that's something that the fairy tale shares with horror, because we talked about all the horrific elements that can be in fairy tales and fables, but anytime you tell these kind of stories, there's often a reason we're telling them. And I think Boy Snowbird and the stories that are in the Bloody Chamber are they exemplify that, I think.
I agree. I mean, Boy Snowbird, the characters are dealing with some really intense, parental trauma issues, particularly Boy. But sometimes they don't even know, because of all the secrets that are going on in it, as all good Gothic and fairy tale stories have. They don't understand why they're reacting the way that they are, when it all comes back from those initial moments of boys' interactions. I'm not going to spoil anything, but boys' interactions with her father, the rat catcher, at the beginning of the story, of course, influence everything to come, whether she wants to think of it or not. And it influences how she then treats the people in her family when she marries. What's his name? Arturo, I think, and meets his daughter from a previous marriage. And that's even dealt with the idea of like the almost like haunting of the previous marriage and the previous life. So yeah, exactly like you said. Like you're seeing the fairy tale stuff and you're like, oh, cool, I see these references. But then it's just layer upon layer upon layer of complexity that I think was built up maybe in the fairy tales with a lot of those evil stepmothers or, however you want to look at it, or issues between parents and children. The fairy tales just hit it and didn't dwell on it. I think some of these writers are really dwelling on some of those relationships and issues and teasing them out in really interesting ways.
You had mentioned the connection between Boy Snowbird and Angela Carter's work when you were talking about the mirrors.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm ashamed to say I had not picked up on that as a connection before you mentioned it, because I was just thinking of it from the fairy tale point of view. But we are going to have to at some point talk about how mirrors, because mirrors, that's one of the things that goes through horror stories as well. I mean, there are so many mirrors in both fairy tales and horror stories, probably because I don't know, it's that idea, I guess, of what you will see when you look into the mirror. We're going to have to explore that at some time. I don't know if this is the episode to do it, but definitely the idea of identity and how somebody sees themselves.
And the uncanny idea of if your image moves differently than you do. I mean, some of the most freakishly disturbing and creepy moments in Boy Snowbird is when someone's looking in a mirror and their image is doing something different from them, because you really don't ever want to see that. And I'm really shocked that they're just like, oh, okay, this must be something that mirrors do. I'm like, no, I'd be running and screaming.
Well, that's one of the tropes in horror movies that like there are just a few things that in horror movies, if it happens on the screen, it will always get me, and that is one of the things. And it's so trite at this point. Like you see somebody like standing in front of an open medicine cabinet in the bathroom, and they're like reaching for their pills or whatever, and as soon as they shut it, there's going to be like something standing behind them. And every horror movie I've ever seen where that happens, it's like I know that's going to happen, and every time they shut it, and I jump a mile, because it's like you said it. I think it's because we are expecting one thing, and we're not expecting something else, right? Or you're watching one of those things, and the other kind of trope in those horror movies is somebody's getting ready and looking in a mirror, and then they turn away, but their mirror image does not. Their mirror image stays there, maybe does like a little creepy smile or something.
Which is creeping me out right now, and there's no mirror near me.
But you think about it, because in what is one of the most famous lines from Snow White is, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And I mean, there's a magic mirror, but she's living, the evil queen is living her life based upon what she sees reflected back to her. And so it's a very deep hatred of self too when you look into that.
Mm-hmm.
Which Oyeyemi mines that field a lot. So that's another connection that I had not thought of. That
Oh yeah. Oyeyemi mines that field well and a lot.
Yeah. We love Oyeyemi. Well, maybe we ought to move. I mean, since we're talking about Boy Snowbird, which is more recent, maybe we ought to talk about some, because I mean, The Bloody Chamber came out in 1979. Let's talk about some more recent kind of fairy tales as horror, or revisionist fairy tales that have been out there. Well, one of the things that really got me interested, okay, let me back up a little bit. you guys know, if you're listeners of this show, and I'm sure Matt and Mel know this, I am a Disney nerd. It's just one of my things. I love horror. But I'm just as likely to sit down and watch a horror movie as I am a Disney movie. Um, and that was what I had always like associated fairy tales with. Like fairy tales, those were the Disney princesses in my head. But then I also had my Gothic background. And again, Gothic novels, they do kind of have a fable-like structure to them. Um, the heroine is kind of the stand-in for the princess, and there's usually either a castle or a castle-like structure. Um, Often there's royalty or people who want to be royalty. um, but a friend of mine had passed me a few years back a new comic, not book or graphic novel, I guess. It's a graphic representation of short stories, is the best way to put it. And that is Emily Carroll's Into the Woods. And I don't know, Matt, Mel, have you guys taken a look at Into the Woods?
I have looked at it. I have not had a chance to read it. It's one of those books that I came across at one point in my life. It was like, I really want to read that, and then did not.
Well, I won't say too much then. I will just say that if fairy tales, and particularly fairy tales that are a little bit on the darker side, if that's something that you like, I highly, highly, highly recommend picking up Emily Carroll's book. It takes on the trope of, the idea of Into the Woods, so almost like a Little Red Riding Hood type story, and it follows several different stories, but it's just beautifully drawn. It is very kind of gothic in the way it's presented. Like, there's a lot of like black and white and red on the page, which is really fun to look at. And she tells these stories, and the stories, I will say, are very sparse, as a lot of graphic novels are, because part of it is looking at the illustrations themselves, but they are creepy. I mean, she delivers some serious chills in just a few words with these. So that's just one of those. I don't know if I can really analyze it in an audio format because it's such a visual book. But that's one of those books that I tell a lot of people, if this is at all your kind of thing, certainly fans of Oyeyemi would love it, or Angela Carter would love it. But if you just like the darker fairy tales, or like where fairy tales and horror kind of crisscross, then I highly recommend Emily Carroll's Into the Woods.
Yeah, I really need to check that out. I heard great things about it. I think it might even be on one of my handwritten to be read lists I have somewhere and just haven't gotten to it yet. There's just so many books and there's not enough time, unfortunately. One that I would add to that is this is Bill Willingham's Vertigo comic series Fables, which I think ran from 2002 to 2015. I have read the first, I think, 3 volumes. So it's, it basically is the idea that all the fairy tale characters or the fable characters are real. Something terrible happened to their world and they have to live with humans. And so you have like animal characters having to live in a certain place, which they don't like. And then you have some of the magical characters who seem human are living in their own kind of cordoned off place. And Snow White and Rose Red are major characters. I think Snow White might be kind of in charge of everybody, and the big bad wolf is her kind of like sidekick. I found them entertaining. So if folks are just interested in kind of like a revisiting of those type of characters in a different kind of environment, or taking them into a contemporary setting, I guess, and all the issues that would cause, I think that could be a cool series to check out.
There were several movies that had done this as well. Like I know there was a couple of Red Riding Hood movies, like versions.
Yeah, Angela Carter wrote the screenplay for Company of Wolves.
Yeah. Oh, yes. But there was another one that was called like maybe Red or something like that. I don't know if it was worth talking about because I remember seeing it, but I don't remember a thing about the movie. But one thing I thought about when I was thinking about these kind of dark fairy tales too, and it's not we've talked a lot about revisionists, but not all of them are, because like that movie Pan's Labyrinth, I think Del Toro really, I mean, he really wrote a new, but he knows what he's doing. But I mean, I think he really, wrote a new fable in making that movie, because that has the whole, I don't know, it has a very storybook, dark fairy tale fantasy tone to it. What do you guys think about that? Would you classify that as a fairy tale?
I think so. I mean, it was definitely. I mean, it's almost like a new fairy tale, if that makes sense. Like it's as if somebody had all the building blocks of fairy tales and all the mythology, but created a story with new creatures, I guess. And you also have the underlying darkness and violence. They're not safe. And you also have the connection between the darkness in the world and the darkness in the story.
Yeah, he was really the only one I could think of who's doing something new. Like you said, taking the building blocks but writing a new fable. I really struggle, but I couldn't think of anybody. I mean, you could think of people who were taking like, okay, well, there's a Snow White character, or there's a Cinderella character, but I could not think of anybody who was doing, okay, well, we're taking the structure, but it's all new, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't really think of another. I can't really think of another example either. I don't know. I mean, everybody's excited because the new Dark Crystal is out, which I haven't had a chance to watch yet. I don't know that would qualify though, in the way that Pan's Labyrinth does.
Well, and this maybe we're crossing into fantasy territory, but you mentioned the Dark Crystal, and a lot of those things from like the late 70s, early 80s.
Never ending story.
Labyrinth.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those.
There was a big bad wolf character in Never Ending Story. They were playing with the tropes.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm gonna have to go. Well, I mean, they go into a storybook, for goodness sake.
Right. Even The Princess Bride. I think The Princess Bride would probably be the clearest example. It is revisionist, and it's also like, storytelling, and it has like the princess and the villain and the wilderness, the woods, and
but now you've got me thinking horror elements.
They're played up for laughs, I guess.
Yeah, I mean I agree with you, but I don't know if it fits our purposes.
Okay. I don't know. I'm thinking on the fly now. You've got me thinking about this.
Well, I'm kind of thinking now that Labyrinth might be the closest, or Dark Crystal, because those do have horror elements to them.
They do. I think the Never Ending Story has some horror elements to it. The wolf and the horse dying, and
the Never Ending Story is absolutely a horror movie. Without question.
Present your case, Matt.
Oh, Mel's already mentioned it. The terrifying wolf and watching a horse die in despair. The Swamp of Despair, or whatever it's called. I'm drawing a blank on it. But yeah, no. Sorry, that was like 7-year-old me speaking from the past. Reliving the trauma of watching that movie. Or just the idea that what they're trying to fight against is nothing. Like the end of everything and the turning into nothing. Like that's pretty horrifying for
existential dread right there is what that is.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Like existential dread is like the scariest thing of them all.
Fed to children. And you wonder why we all are the way we are.
I rewatched The Neverending Story, like 4 or 5 years ago with you, Matt, and some other people, and seeing the wolf again on the screen like made me remember how terrified I was of it as a child. It was still disconcerting.
Y'all haven't mentioned the scene that terrified me as a kid. It was not the wolf. It was the statues that shot lasers out of their eyes.
Ooh, yeah, that one's pretty big too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep. The idea, yeah, that whole thing. I mean, they were just, I guess, because it was the size of them, but also that they kind of looked angelic in like a really scary way, which I think that was the first time I had ever been confronted with that dichotomy in one. I don't know. I was very, oh, and they had big breasts on them. Which also, I think my like tiny little brain was like, what am I looking at?
I mean, you're already going through an existential crisis, and then you're trying to process all of that. It was just too much.
All right. Well, I will say this. We started off with Angela Carter, and I think we should end with Angela Carter. And just a recommendation that anyone who has not read any of her stories, I highly recommend them. I feel like she's an author that people may recognize the name, but I don't know. A lot of people may not have read her before, so that'll be the final recommendation here is to go read her stuff if you haven't read it. And we really only talked about that one story, so there's a lot there to dissect. But this is just a reminder that your co-hosts, Lisa and Mel, wrote a book. Satisfy your craving for extraordinary authors and exceptional fiction. Meet the women writers who defied convention to craft some of your literature's strangest tales in a new nonfiction book, Monster She Wrote, which also includes Angela Carter. The book came out on September 17th. So you can buy it now by going to the Quirk Books website or through any major book retailer. We have been making our way around mainly the South, doing a few book talks and signing some books. But we are also going to be at the Salem Horror Fest in Salem, Massachusetts. So if you are listening to this before, I think it's October 14th is the date we're going to be there. Then if you're anywhere nearby, consider coming and saying hello. We would love that. But if not, we would still love to hear from you. As always, we are across social media. We're at No Fear Cast. Remember, that is KNOW on Twitter and Instagram. And we also have a Facebook page, and we're trying to be better about updating those with things that are going on. If you'd like to contact us by email, which we absolutely check our emails. You can do that at nofearcast@gmail.com. So if you have a comment about maybe your favorite revisionist fairy tale with a horror twist, we would love to hear about it. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll get access to exclusive content. So that's mini episodes in the weeks that we do not release a main episode. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but I cannot stress enough how much that helps us, because every time someone rates and reviews us, that means that more people will be able to see what we're doing because of the weird recommendation algorithm. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.